The whole point of strategy is to say no to most things and focus in on a small number of really high leverage things. Like you have to make that bet. When you see companies with 9 company level OKRs at the top level or whatever, right? They're just trying to do all the things. Your chance of success is already low if you do not focus down on 1 or 2 core key bets and do that strategy work to figure out where that leverage is. You're not going to succeed.
Eli, I have heard so many good things from many different members of the Reforge community. So thank you so much for joining me today first.
Yeah, happy to be here, man. Excited to have a fun convo.
It's going to be great, but I want to start. We look at Chime, we look at Yelp. These are some incredible product orgs. How did you first make your way into the world of product and growth, and what did that entry point look like for you, Eli?
Yeah, great question. So if you go all the way back, I've got a couple of degrees in computer science. I did bachelor's, master's in computer science. I was an engineering manager for a while. I think this used to be a more common path into product, right? It used to be one of the most common paths. These days, it's much less, which is like good, I think. But so I was the engineering path. I had a startup of my own for a little while. Like a big chunk of my product career was at Yelp. I was at Yelp for a little over 8 years across a whole bunch of different areas of that product and business. One of the cool things about Yelp is it's really like 10 different vertical marketplaces combined into a single product, which is a fantastic place to sort of like up level and grow up as a product and growth professional, because you really see like all the different kinds of dynamics in marketplaces. It's also consumer. It has a big SMB play. It also actually has a pretty big enterprise play. And I worked across all of those things. And so it was a really good kind of like growing up in this space. So I did a whole bunch of different things at Yelp. I tended to be the person that got tapped to do 0 to 1 stuff there a lot. I think organizationally, maybe we didn't have a lot of organizational muscle around doing that. And so I got tapped to do that in a number of different areas a few different times, which was super cool. One of the ways that we built new product there also was through acquisition. And so back in 2015 now, we bought a company called E1075. It's a food delivery startup. And so I kind of got dropped in to be head of product for that subsidiary, helped grow that business. This wasn't our original intent, but we actually sold it to Grubhub just about 2 years later for almost double what we paid, a little more than double what we paid, plus a fantastic partnership agreement that got us out of the fulfillment game, but let us keep a lot of the much higher margin sort of lead gen revenue in the food delivery business, which was fantastic. That was a really fun experience. And then I kind of rolled back into the mothership at Yelp, worked across, again, a number of kind of cross-functional marketplace type initiatives. And then at my last sort of stint there was this like building out, again, brand new 0 to 1, brand new product and business line, kind of in a hybrid GM product leader role with P&L. This is, I think, we can talk more about this if you want. Like one of the things that I have seen myself and with companies that I advise is if you're trying to do true 0 to 1 inside of a later stage company and like find your next horizon, trying to do it inside of the sort of legacy product org vastly reduces your chances of success. And don't even get me started on kind of like innovation orgs or those kind of things. But the model that I've seen most successful is the model that I did at Yelp, where you actually really give somebody P&L responsibility as, like they are a founder, right? And treat them like a founder. We actually did board of directors meetings with the C-suite for the sort of businesses that we were incubating like that.
I just want to go there because we're seeing every big company now say, oh, we're integrating AI into new products, into existing product lines, and we're able to move faster than ever. We can move fast. We can move fast.
Yeah.
Can they, having done it inside an incumbent?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think big companies can do these things quick. I think there are 2 versions of what you're talking about, actually. One is the like, let's supercharge the things we are already doing with this new tech. That's sort of a fairly unique thing in this new LLM wave that you didn't have particularly often before. And you've actually seen a few companies do a decent job of like the first step of that very quickly, which is impressive for those companies. True 0 to 1 though, where you're really like, you're serving a new need or a new customer or a new vertical, like you're really expanding, solving a problem you hadn't really solved before, that really requires you to do, again, what I have seen is your highest chance of success is if you carve out a startup org. And, you know, everyone likes to throw around, we're a startup within a big company. If like the leader of that doesn't have P&L, you're not a startup within a big company, right? I think that is the important piece, which is like, you need to fund this as an independent unit that is looking at a business line holistically and is autonomous within the sort of like spending of that capital, right? Like a startup, you should fund them a little bit at first, right? And they should come back and show progress and ask for more funds as if, you know, they're doing their seed, they're doing their A, right? Like that's how you should do that, because that's the only way you really like succeed at those hard problems.
Eli, I'm loving this because we're just rolling. Why on earth would brilliantly talented people do that in a company where they don't own it? Like, go out and raise money for your own company and come to people like me who'll give you millions of dollars.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think their biggest reason is there are some things that only can be built as an extension of a successful business that cannot be built as a standalone business, right? And so I think like some people do this. If you are trying to build a totally adjacent business inside of a large company, don't do that. The company shouldn't do it. You shouldn't do it. It's not a good idea. The way that you succeed is you build something that leverages some aspect of the success that the business and the legacy product has already had to be able to build something that nobody else could build, right? And so I think that's the thing that you're doing there of like, building 0 to 1 inside of a larger org, you are leveraging all of the advantage, all of the customers, all of the data, all of the tech, like all of that is at your disposal to build something that in most cases couldn't have been built outside the company. That's the main reason.
I also think of like speed to distribution as well, which
Exactly.
is that you probably could do the product, but it would take 5 years of distribution build to get to a point where you have enough customers to actually do it meaningfully. And actually, it may not be the passion of your career, but it's something that's cool to do. Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely. I think that's true. And in terms of speed of learning, right, I actually think it's a fantastic sort of like, as you said, accelerant to the speed of learning in a bunch of these areas because you can turn on to distribution however you want overnight when you're ready to do it, turn it on to learn, turn it back off, right? Like you have these levers that you don't have when you're in a small startup.
I totally agree with you. Can I ask, when we look at Yelp in all its wonderful varieties, and then when we look at Chime, which we haven't discussed, but you spent time at for kind of close to 2 years, according to trusty LinkedIn, one takeaway from each, Eli, that really impacted how you think about product, what would it be from each?
The first thing that comes to mind is actually the same takeaway, and it's sort of the reason that I joined Chime. I think a lot of people sort of look at like, hey, you're doing consumer and marketplaces and you went to a fintech, like that's so different. Like most people don't shift. That's like a very different market. The thing for me is, I mean, one, Chime is actually much more of a consumer product company than it is a fintech at the end of the day, and so that kind of came. But the sort of takeaway for me here is incentive alignment. Like I think my core learning from every different vertical of marketplace that I worked on at Yelp is incentive alignment is the most powerful lever you have in a business, definitely in a marketplace. But I think Chime is actually the example of, Chime is not a marketplace, but Chime has an amazing level of incentive alignment between the business model of the company and value to the customer that has really led to a lot of Chime success. And I think that was my learning from marketplaces is like, if you ship something where it makes it better for the supply side, the demand side, and the company's P&L, that's when you can really accelerate a marketplace. And when marketplaces don't have that, they struggle because they're trying to make these trade-offs between supply or demand or their P&L, and like everything is challenging. When you find that incentive alignment, everything takes off. So that I think was my takeaway from Yelp. And Chime has the same thing, actually. Chime has that same dynamic between their own business model and their customers' incentive, which is really what has driven their growth curve. So maybe one takeaway, but it's like it's a key takeaway.
It's so funny that you say that. It reminds me actually of Brian Balfour's episode that we did from Reforge, where he talks about business model fit, and when that works in a similar way, it really creates incredible outcomes. So I love that. Can I ask you? You're an advisor now, and I want to kind of really deconstruct this because I think there's so much opacity actually to it, and the term's thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
When I say advisor and advisory roles, what does that mean, Eli?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's especially appropriate because I think it is changing. I think historically, again, it was a very opaque thing that was maybe applied inconsistently, and the word got thrown around, and people were doing sort of different levels of things, but both founders and operators who might be advisors didn't really understand what that looked like or what they should do or how they should do it. We are at sort of the early stages of an evolution of much more targeted kind of like ways to exchange value between founders and people that can help them, and much more structured ways. And so I think this is what I've been doing, and I love it. I think there's a lot of exciting stuff here.
So how does that look then? If we take that one step further, what does that look like in reality?
A few different pieces here. I see kind of like 3 top level shapes of advising today. The first one is company level advising or founder level advising, where the perspective is across the whole company, the whole business. You're really like a partner to that founder. This is the kind of advising that I do, and there's some sub areas here. You then see functional advising. So think like a marketing advisor, right? Like that person is really coming in to help bridge a gap within a particular function. And then you have sort of like domain like deeper domain kind of advising. So think like SEO, or if you're in a deep domain like international logistics, like people who are deep in that domain, right? These are sort of the three high level shapes of advising that I think you're seeing now.
When you think about company level advising, how does one do that really? Because everyone to an extent is a functional leader. Is that like CEO coaching? Is that like CEO therapist?
That's a great question. I'll dive more into that, but I think that coaching is a different thing here that I think is also good to lay out in this map, right? You may know, but just for folks, I think CEO coaching is something that has gotten more visibility recently, and so people are more familiar. But coaching is really about personal and professional leadership development, right? Like that is the core of what coaching is about. Think even a sports coach, they're like helping you at the core aspects of being a leader. Some coaches have a functional flavor, right? So you see folks like Ken Norton, who's a leadership coach with the product flavor, right? But at the end of the day, they're a coach. They're helping you up level as a leader. And actually, this is where you see a number of folks have coaches who are not in the function that they came from. And that's totally okay, because leadership is pretty universal, actually, right? Like that's something that works across the board. And so that's actually its own distinct piece here. When I talk about company level advising, and I can dive a little bit also into kind of like my thing specifically, but just staying high level for a second, company level advising, like the reason founders are talking to me is because they want help growing their business. Like that, at the end of the day, that is the purpose of the company. That is the founder's job, is to grow the business. The ways they do that span across people, org, culture, and all of their different functions, right? And so company level advising is really that, like, I'm helping you do your job at that highest level with the goal of growing this company. Whereas coaching is, I'm helping you become a better version of yourself.
So when we think about like timings for different advisory positions, is there a right or a wrong time for different advisory positions within different companies and spaces?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think I see founders struggle with this question quite a bit. Maybe starting with functional advisors, I think there are two things to consider when you think about functional advisors. One mistake I see founders make a lot is trying to delegate the core pieces of their strategy because of their own background. And so I think one sort of like piece of advice I give a lot to people is, as a founder, you should be owning the strategy for your primary growth lever. If that's product, marketing, sales, right? Like whatever the primary growth lever for your business is, you should not delegate that thing. I think a lot of founders are like, hey, I don't have a lot of background in X. Like I need to bring in somebody who's super experienced in X. It is okay to bring somebody in to leverage and help you learn and help you through it. But at the end of the day, you need to own that strategy. You cannot delegate that strategy. And so that I think is something to be careful of in general, both for full-time hires and for functional advisors, because I see people do that. Yeah,
so
jump in.
You can't even delegate it if you hire it. Say it's product. No.
Yeah, you can't. And at the end of the day, like, again, if it's the primary growth lever for your business, it is the most important piece of your business. And at the end of the day, the person you hire will not have the full company perspective that you do. They will not have the right level of skin in the game, and they will not be incentivized to take the right level of risk. Only the founder is going to take the right level of risk that is required, right? You definitely can hire. Hiring is important. You need leverage. You need experts in different areas. But if those are offensive areas, we can talk about offense and defense later on if you want, but if those are offensive areas, which are like the primary growth levers for your business, you need to be owning that at the end of the day and leveraging that expertise to help make you do the job better, but you need to be owning it. For defensive areas, absolutely, you can hire and delegate, and you should hire and delegate, right? So like customer service, if customer service is not a primary growth lever for your business, which once in a while it is, but usually it is not, you absolutely can hire an experienced CS leader to run that area for you and just take it totally out of mind. But if you're a product-led business, the product is a major growth lever for your business, hiring an experienced product leader and then hoping that they are going to figure out the strategy for you is just not a good path.
Okay, so if we decide that we do actually need some external expertise and it's not a core lever, and so we're able to and we should, how do we determine whether we should bring in a consultant and an advisor, essentially, an incredible growth leader like anyone in the Reforge community, or bring in a head of growth full time? How do we decide between advisor versus hire?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially if you think about function. There tends to be sort of a time factor here. Again, because if, let's say, product-led growth is sort of the primary lever that you're using, you need to be owning that. An advisor, a company-level advisor who is sort of leaning in to teach you to fish, right? Which is kind of, to me, the advising side of the line here. is fantastic even from the very beginning, because that person has got that experience. You're the one actually making the decisions. You're the one actually executing at the end of the day, but they are helping you get better at doing that thing and giving you guidance. That's good early on. At some point, as you scale, you're going to have to start building a function around this. As that function grows bigger, you will need leverage in running and managing that function that is executing on your strategy. There tends to be a gap period for most startups where they are not yet big enough. It doesn't yet make sense to hire a full head of growth, head of marketing, head of product, but it's getting big enough that it's taking too much of that founder's time, or it's really what it's doing is taking lower leverage. You're using your cycles in a lower leverage way than you should be as a founder. Again, it's not because you want to step back from product strategy, but it's that you want to be focused on the highest leverage pieces there. That's where fractional can actually be really useful. And so a fractional person can sort of bridge that gap for you where you're not to the point yet where you need to hire, you're not big enough to hire a full-time person. So that's one approach. Functional advisor is the other one. So sometimes you'll have sort of a more junior people manager in one of those functional areas, and a functional advisor can be really helpful to sort of bridge the gap between the person who's actually executing the org and kind of like the thought leadership you need in that functional area.
A functional advisor would be like out-of-home expert in terms of marketing, and they would sit on top of a demand gen team and they would provide out-of-home is that a good example?
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, totally.
And then at some point you would get to the point where you do need to hire somebody.
So we get to the point where we actually want to hire this advisor. Okay. What should we look for in the advisor specifically? Should they have done it before? Should they have been at a similar company to us? Should they have been advisors before? What is a good advisor to get?
This is a great question. Again, I think this actually goes back to that shape thing as well. For a functional advisor, let's again use maybe the marketing advisor as an example. For a functional advisor, I would say you want to figure out what the lever is, right? To your point about performance or brand or SEO content, like you don't want to delegate figuring out what the lever is. You should be figuring out what the lever is. Once you figure out what the lever is, bring in somebody who has done that thing at similar types of companies to yours and at similar stage to help you with that lever. That's a fantastic sort of step path for that functional advisor. On the company level advisor side, it is more difficult. The company level advisor thing, this is where you kind of have this depth of engagement spectrum. You have your traditional kind of high level company advisor on one end, right? This is I think was your most common sort of company level advisor historically. When you're a high level advisor, you're doing this thing where essentially you're meeting with the founder once a month, sometimes every other month because they got busy. The founder's coming to you with some problem that they're facing, right? And they're like, hey, here's this problem we're facing. You're like, oh yeah, I've seen something like that before. Here's what we did. Here's what we learned. Here's what we tried. Good luck. And then the founder goes away. That's your typical sort of high level advisor. The newer model, and the model that I'm doing, is what I've been calling hands-on advising. And so again, back to earlier, we were talking about this line between advising on one side where it's all about teach to fish, and then sort of consulting, contracting, fractional, interim, full-time on the other, where delivery is happening, right? What I'm doing, this hands-on advising thing, is on the advising side of the line. So I'm there to teach you to fish, not to fish for you, but I'm about as close to the line as you can get without crossing it, right? And so what that tactically means is my engagements with founders tend to be weekly. Like I'm sitting down with that founder every week. We are diving in and working on whatever is the highest leverage thing for the business at any given time. And then I'm spending some of my own time outside of those weekly sessions, diving into their data, watching their qual, getting up to speed enough on their product and their business and their customer to be a thought partner in those weekly sessions, which is something you don't get to do when you're doing the high level advising. You're just not close enough to the ground to really be a thought partner. They're getting value from mining your experience. If your experience lines up with what they are doing, this is maybe to your question about what you look for. If you're doing high level, you got to make sure that that person, you kind of have to make some bets on what kind of problems do you think you're going to run into and hope you get some people that have seen exactly those kinds of things before. The hands-on thing is nice because you get to combine the experience with those things before with true thought partnership in doing the job week to week, right? And this is why I love doing this hands-on advising thing. I feel like I provide way more value in the hands-on advising space. I also learn way more. Like my learning velocity as a hands-on advisor is honestly like exponentially faster even than when I was an operator.
Do you not want to take it one step further though, actually go down into the functional weeds? Because now you're relying on the CEO to relay everything to the functional leader. I would want you with my marketing team, with my product team, to actually relay and teach.
Yeah, great. This is a great point. This comes up a lot. This is where the teach to fish is really important, right? Because the founder can't rely on me. If they are not able to run the functions of their company, that's going to be a problem. And so it's much higher leverage for me to help them up level in how they execute. This is where, again, at the hands-on level, we work on everything from strategy to then how do I set up my org to execute on this, to we did this last week and here's what we learned. Let's think about that and make new decisions going forward. Because you're there every week, you're sort of like, you're a second brain for that founder all the way through the process, and you're helping them up level all the way across. If you try to embed me in one of your functions, then you're getting too far away from that function if it's a core offensive leverage growth function for your company, which you shouldn't be. And if you need me to do those things, that's going to be a problem because I'm not going to be there the whole time. And I'm only there an hour a week, right? And so like you really need to be able to do it. And I can help you get better at doing that thing.
But if you're thinking about creating virality in the referral mechanism of your consumer fintech app, just fuck off and I mean this in the nicest way, talk to my head of product. He's on it. I'm getting banking licenses. I'm getting fundraising. I'm stopping the business going out of cash. My head of product is the person for you.
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
You are if incentivized virality is going to be the primary growth lever for your business.
But if it's the primary growth lever for your business, I'm not hiring you.
Right. You don't want to hire for that person. This is what I'm saying. The CEO founder needs to own that strategy, and I help them figure it out and execute on it. Right.
But that's what I'm saying. If it's the primary, I'm not hiring you because it's the primary. If it's the secondary, then I can delegate it to someone else and you work with them.
Yeah, I think the thing here is people can get a lot of help from a hands-on advisor who knows how to do this stuff and has done it before on the primary lever. I think that's the key thing. The primary lever is what's important. That's where the founder should be spending their time. That's where I can actually provide the most value.
But there's still value in secondary levers. And like, I would have advisors in each. Like I want out-of-home billboard advisor. I want virality in the consumer referral product. Fuck it, let's have an advisor for each.
You probably heard this from Brian too. At early stages of startups, you are almost always much better off focusing on one primary growth lever and ignoring the rest. You need to layer them on later, but you shouldn't be doing it in an early stage. So when you are laying those on, you are now growing the org and you're actually probably hiring in some of those places to layer those on.
So what stage of company are we at here then, Eli? Are we like Series A, B, or...
So yeah, most of the companies I advise are from seed to C, so Series C. I also have a handful now of clients that are actually much later stage businesses where they're doing this incubation of their wave 2. This is the one place where I advise non-founders. If they've set up the structure that we were talking about before, where they have a GM with P&L ownership, doing this wave 2, 0 to 1 kind of product market fit work, I can advise that person as if I was advising a founder. So that tends to be the split. I'm helping them from seed through C, and then I'm helping them sort of like wave 2 out the sort of extraction side of the curve.
Okay, I totally get you there. You mentioned seed. Is it too early at seed for most growth advisors, given the fact that you don't really have any form of flywheel or traction yet?
Yes, most traditional growth advisors are more like that functional advisor, right? They are good at a particular type of growth. And once you figure out the right type of growth for you, having that person helps a lot. I actually help people earlier than that because some of the things I help them with at seed is let's figure out what is the right type of growth for you, right? That's where, again, I sort of see myself as a holistic founder advisor, not just a growth advisor.
I totally get you. Okay, no, that makes sense. And should these advisors have done it before at the stage of company that you are at, in the geography that you are? Because you can imagine, like, you have a Facebook growth advisor who did, Facebook news feed. It may be very different if you're being hired into Chime, where it's a very different. Should they have done it before?
I think it helps a lot. I think the things that are, it doesn't have to be identical, because if it's identical, you're never going to find the person, right? I think the things that matter most are, one is like, did they develop the playbook or did they scale the playbook? I think you see a lot of split between somebody who scaled a playbook that was developed prior to them, or they developed the playbook from scratch. And in all of these different areas, you should be thinking about, are we developing the playbook or are we trying to scale the playbook? And you want to match your sort of advising to which stage you're at from that perspective. Within the sort of functional places, I think, again, on the growth side, like if your primary lever is virality, definitely get somebody that did virality stuff, right? If they come from a performance world, they're gonna struggle to help you with the core virality stuff, and vice versa, right? I think that matters a lot. Geography also mostly matters. This is where it depends, right? I think there are things where the geography matters a lot, and there are things where the geography matters less. So like brand people need to know the culture of the place that they are doing brand into. Performance works pretty similarly in a lot of different places, right? And then like maybe fintech is a good example where just like the core business models and the infrastructure dynamics are very different in different geographies, right?
How do you advise founders when they get sold? There's a lot of like consultants / advisors now who come out and say, I did this. How can founders determine true attribution of who did what?
This is, I think, a general problem. I'll tell you my approach to it. And I think more people should maybe do this, and maybe more founders should do it, which is like, I don't try to make claims with founders. I just help them. My model is I meet as many founders as I can, and I help them as much as I can for free. And we work together. And if at some point we feel like I have capacity and there's a good fit and I'm bringing a lot of value, then we formalize the relationship. That to me is the way to do it, because then nobody has to believe anything. Just work with somebody, and then you can see if they're valuable for what you need, and you can see if there's a fit, right? It's both their experience and their knowledge, but also like you're working pretty closely with this person. You got to be able to work together, right?
I totally agree. It's like a freemium trial in many ways.
It is absolutely a freemium trial. Yeah.
When does it convert?
It depends. I think usually with the people that I work with, after 3 or 4 calls together, we are both probably at the place where we're like, okay, like we either are super jazzed to work together and we're going to do this, or this is probably not the right time or not the right fit, and we can check back in 6 months or something. So it's usually within that amount of time that you kind of get it. It also affects sort of like the help that I'm giving them. I want to figure out like, hey, if we're going to work together week to week, I want to help you with these things. I don't need to help you as much with these things because I'm going to be there to help you with those. If I'm not going to work with you, let me set you up for success. Like, let me give you the things to try to execute on this yourself. And so again, by sort of like the 3rd or 4th time we've worked together, you kind of have to start making that split of like, am I trying to set you up for success, or I'm going to be there with you?
In terms of setting up for success, I think failure happens in surprises. What do you want to set up or align on before agreeing to a formal commitment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think it's more important in the place where we are not going to work together, but I'll also answer your question. When we are not going to work together, I'm really trying to set you up with like core frameworks and approaches to maximize your chances of success without me there. So that's sort of what I'm looking for there. Again, this is maybe a difference between your traditional high-level FI-FAST advisor and the kind of advising I do. My advising is month to month, week to week. Like the way that I'm doing my engagements is we just work together. And if any given time, either of us feels like we're not getting enough value out of the relationship, we just stop. And there's no more equity that you're giving me. There's no more cash that's changing hands. Like we can just stop whenever we want. We can pause. I've actually had clients where we work together for a while, we pause, they go focus on something else, and then they come back later and then we work together again. And so I think that model works much better because there's no commitment on either side. You can just start working together and see how it's going. And if you're getting value, you're getting value. And if you're not getting value, you stop.
I totally agree with you. When we think about kind of you mentioned that equity, you mentioned, obviously cash, I'm sure is part of it too. How should founders think about compensation for advisors in this way?
Again, depends on the shape. Maybe all these answers depend on the shape. For company level advising, for the thing that I'm doing, really, like what you're thinking about is like, do you believe this person is going to have a substantial probability of helping you bend the curve, right? Like the reason I'm there is to help you bend the curve, essentially. If you believe there's some % chance that I'm going to be able to help you do that versus not working with me, then it's worth the value. If you don't, you shouldn't work with me, right? I think that's the key thing. The fractional and like functional level advisors are a little bit different because they're more like comps to benchmark against there, right? Like you could hire a full-time person, you maybe hire a more junior person. And so usually the way you're thinking about compensation in those is sort of scaled from what a full-time version of that person would look like, if that makes sense.
I totally get you. And so when we think about that, like what does that actually look like in the equity and the salary package?
For a fractional?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, like I think so let's take a fractional CMO, right, as an example, or fractional CTO is one I've been seeing more commonly now too. Usually what you would do is you would look at what you would hire a full-time C-level in that position for, and then you would just scale it back by the fraction. So usually it's like 2 days a week or 3 days a week. Those tend to be the most common versions of that. And so you're really just scaling that back. So you also generally don't put a cliff on the equity because sometimes it's a 6-month engagement or whatever, but you're really just taking what you have and scale it back down to the 3 or 2. That's like a very broad rule. Sometimes there are other things to do there, but like that tends to be the common path.
Respectfully, if you want Casey Winters, if you want Ely Lerner, if you want any of these guys, you got to pay the fuck up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, I think like Elena, in case you know, I've talked about this a few times actually. Like, this is also where choosing which product you want to buy from this person is important, right? Because Elena does also more of the kind of hands-on advising things that I do, and she does these interim gigs, right? She's at Dropbox right now. She was at Amplitude before. To get her in-house like that in that interim gig is very expensive, right? But that's the product they wanted to buy. But also when she's not doing those gigs, she's offering the same kind of high-level advising that I am, where there's just more leverage, right? Again, it depends on what you need from her. And sometimes you can't get it at the smaller sort of engagement style, but the higher leverage is you're getting more impact to your business per hour. You're paying more comp for like the number of hours that they're putting in, but it's less total comp because you're getting the high impact hours. That's how I think about what I do too. It's like, I'm trying to maximize the impact of my focus cycles.
Okay, I get you. So we agree then on this compensation structure. In terms of equity, what do equity packages look like? Just to help me again. I know it's detailed and money's always uncomfortable to talk about, but so many fans listen and they're like, what does it actually look like? Just help.
The package that I do is, let's call it 80-20 cash and equity. Right. But again, on a month-to-month basis for this hands-on advising. The nice thing about that is it's not a lot of equity up front, right? If we end up working together for years, and this does happen sometimes. I mean, Casey has clients he's done 2+ years on. I have somebody I'm working with that I've been working with for at least 1.5 years. So sometimes you actually find really high value long-term engagements, and then that starts adding up a little bit. But early on, you're not giving away that much equity for the value that you're getting, right? You're actually skewed more towards the cash because it's sort of this like, we're exchanging value as we go.
I totally get you. Okay, so 80-20 there. Okay, so we agree on this 80-20 split. Now, thank you. You are advising me. I'm very excited. I'm a hypothetical founder and you're working with me. What can I do, Ely, to set you and us up for success in that first month?
There's sort of 3 key things I see as signals of successful relationship. And again, I'm looking for these things in this sort of free trial mode to decide if I want to work with you, but just so you understand, right? Like, really, especially when you're early on and like trying to figure out strategy, you can ask questions of data, you can ask questions of customers, and you can ship small things quickly to learn. Like, those are the levers that you need to be able to pull. If you cannot pull all 3 of those levers, that can be a challenge. There have been times where one of those levers people are struggling with, and I can come in, again, because I'm teach you to fish at the ground level. If you just really struggle to ship quickly, I've actually done that. Like, I've worked with people where we start working on strategy and then we realize their teams just can't ship. And so we sort of put the strategy on pause for a little bit, and I help dive in and say, like, let me help you figure out how to get your teams to a place where they can ship really quickly. So if that can happen, we can do that. Data is one where, like, if you just have no data, it's going to be hard. I probably need to say, like, come back to me when you have instrumentation.
So I've got a couple of questions. Why do teams struggle to ship?
Yeah, that's a great, you want to do that question first? We could do a whole session on that, but lots of different reasons. But the most common ones are engineering ownership of outcomes. I think that, like, the strongest lever that you can pull to really drive high functioning engineering teams is engineering ownership of outcomes. I think very frequently you get teams that set up where the engineering team feels like it's owning output and not outcomes. And that leads to all kinds of things. So that's one.
Pause. What's output, not outcomes? Just so we understand that.
Ship the feature, right? Like, I'm engineering, a ticket shows up in my Jira or whatever. It says we got to build X. I build X, right? I feel like my job is to build the thing you tell me to build. That is, I think, one of the biggest gaps between really high output engineering teams and engineering teams that struggle to have high output. That's one of them. That answer that question? Yeah.
Yeah. No, you totally did that. Sorry.
Yeah. 2 is actually this offense and defense thing. And so I think another very common thing we see, and this is, we may not even have time to jump into this framework, but we can if you want, which is like, I have this framework that I've written about that I've used with almost every company that I advise, of thinking about everything you're doing as a company, especially things that your product and engineering teams are doing, because that's the highest leverage, highest opportunity cost as either offense or defense. And then there's neither, which you probably shouldn't be doing. You see a lot of companies where a lot of cycles are going to things that are very sort of like marginally impactful to the business overall, right? And to maybe preview the framework a little bit, offense is things that are really like targeted at, it's the small number of bets that are targeted at pushing your business to the next level. If it's 10 things, that's also a problem. And they have to be things that are really focused on pushing your business to the next level. Defense is things you have to do. There are always things that are not doing, like moving business metrics, that need to happen, mainly because they are protecting against downside risk, right? Like if they didn't happen, if you didn't do it at all, there's some downside risk that's going to happen.
So my question to you is then, if we have like defensive, it's reliability, it's security, it's small upgrades, isn't offensive a co-pilot strategy for Figma or a new product? What's offensive and what's in between?
Great. And then we should talk about how you should think about those defensive bets, because this is the other place that people fall down. Offensive bets, absolutely. So I think in earlier stages of companies, they tend to be growth focused, right? It's like, what is your probably one primary growth loop, and how do you accelerate that growth loop? Because you're looking for offensive bets should be compounding. You want to find things where the more you invest there, you get more and more compounding returns, right? As opposed to these little short-term one-off. You can move a business metric one-off, but it doesn't do it in a compounding way. That's not offense. At later stages, things like product market fit expansion absolutely are your offense, right? To your point, if you're Figma and you're building your Copilot, that is probably one of your core 1 to 3 key strategic bets for the company, for sure. On the defensive side, I think a key thing about performance is a good one. Risk and fraud is another one, right? Technical scaling, all of these things are in this space. A key aspect of defense is that there's almost always a diminishing returns curve. There's a point on that curve where you have reduced the risk of the downside to a significant amount, not to zero, because if you try to move the risk to zero, you're going to be way down the diminishing returns curve. It's going to take massive amount of investment, and you're still probably not going to get the risk to zero, right? So really, it's about finding that diminishing returns point and not investing past that point, because every cycle that you're investing past that diminishing returns point, you could be putting into offense, which is just the opportunity cost. People really undervalue the opportunity cost of those cycles, right? Especially because, as we said, offense is compounding. And so things that compound, like the time value of money here, right? The sooner you invest in those things, the more that curve is going to bend over time.
And so the opportunity, just so I understand, so the opportunity cost of getting security and reliability at 95% instead of 100% is actually, we could move those engineers to an offensive strategy and have an alternating strategy with those resources.
With compounding returns. Exactly. Right?
How do you know where that break point is, though?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think it depends. And one of the big key things here on building a really high functioning engineering team is hiring engineering leadership, especially, and folks who are able to think this way and are really good at making estimations of where these things are. And so one example, I think, is like technical scaling, right? It's like, all right, our infrastructure, once we hit 10 million users, like we know our infrastructure is going to fall over or somewhere in that range, right? And it's okay to pad that a little bit. Like you can be careful and be like, you know what, let's make sure we don't get past 8 million, right? Just to be sure, because we're not going to be perfect about it. And then what you can do is work backwards, right? And you can say, okay, we're pretty sure that the effort required to move our infrastructure to the next level of scale is going to be 4 months of work. We have projections, like our CFO should have projections about where we think we're going to grow over what amount of time. We can work backwards from those projections and say like, okay, this is going to take us 4 months of work. We're going to hit 8 million users, we think, by this point. And so like, again, let's buffer ourselves. You don't want to be right. It's okay to not be right on the line. Let's be like, let's start that 5 months early, but we're not going to start it now. We're going to wait until the last possible moment to start that thing. Because again, the opportunity cost of those cycles now, we should be putting into that compounding offensive thing. That said, you got to keep an eye on it. Like, don't just do that one time and then assume you were right. Like those projections are going to change all the time. If you start growing faster, you're going to have to pull that back in. But that really helps you optimize kind of how you're investing those resources.
So for me as a CEO, do I sit down with the CPO or the product leader and do we literally map out offense and defense and then map out resources accordingly? How do we kind of
Yeah.
top down instill that?
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. The other piece of this is actually org. I've been working on a workshop for this actually, that I've like come into companies and try to like help them up level at this really quickly. So we've done a couple of these now, but like the core sort of phases of this generally are, once you understand the concepts really well and your org understands the concepts, go in and look at everything you are planning to do right now, like your whole roadmap, and essentially tag all the things as offense and defense and figure out, and neither, because you're always going to have a bunch of things that are like, this is actually not offense. It's not really defense. Should we really be doing this right now? Maybe we shouldn't, right? And that's going to help a lot. But once you do that, actually, one of the things that can be really high leverage is aligning your org around offensive and defensive bets can also be really powerful, right? Because then it allows you to have really focused teams on those offensive bets that are not getting distracted by other things. And focus is how you make progress, right?
What does that look like in reality, aligning the team around offensive and defensive bets?
Yeah. So again, I think like the most common version of this is actually you have, sometimes this is called like a core experience org that really owns all of the defense. One of the things that I've seen be really effective is when you have a core experience org that owns every piece of the defense, all of the defenses within that org, and no non-defense is in that org. That really lets them prioritize apples to apples, defense against defense. That is you're empowering them in a much stronger way. And then you have an org for probably each of your offensive bets. Again, like you should at most have 3 core offensive bets and an org that is dedicated to each of those things.
Do you ever see an offensive bet turn into a defensive and a defensive turn into an offensive?
Yeah, that's a great question. You definitely do. The most common place for that is as you top out a growth loop. And so I think like you can imagine, the first growth loop for your business at some point is going to kind of start topping out that S curve and be more in extraction phase, right? You need to be layering on a second one. You should start before it totally starts topping out. Like that will become the offensive bet. Once it starts topping out, you still need to invest in it. Like you still need to be, right? Like if it's a virality loop, like you can't just be like, okay, we're starting to get lower returns. We're just going to ignore it from now on. It starts turning into a defensive thing where you're like, we need to keep maintaining this, but additional resourcing on it is not producing additional returns, right? We're now in this diminishing returns curve. So then that moves, like that virality, those things move into the defensive sphere. The opposite one also happens. Actually, an example of the opposite one here that I think I see is trust and safety. Trust and safety is usually defense, right? It's you're avoiding downside risk, but sometimes it becomes offense. And like Airbnb is a good example, actually, where trust and safety becomes offense, because like a core barrier for Airbnb is this idea that like, I'm in somebody else's home, right? Like that's a core barrier to value delivery for your product. And so that's a place where actually like, and they've invested a huge amount in trust and safety overall. And the reason for that is they are getting outside returns by doing that, because every sort of incremental point of trust that people have in that, like, I'm going to go to somebody else's home and it's going to be okay, they're driving sort of like net new demand that didn't exist when they didn't have that trust, right? And so that's, again, like in some cases, trust and safety is, most cases, trust and safety is defense, but sometimes it can actually be offense.
How do I make the defense org people not feel like staples and bread and butter that's a bit boring?
I mean, the one thing to remember here, I mean, talking about this is really important and how you talk about it is really important. But the one thing to remember here is defense is equally important to offense, if not more important, right? Like the whole point is that these are existential. If you do not do these things, you're not going to have a company to invest in offense. You need to be making sure that everybody understands how important these things are. You need to be celebrating it in the right way. I think this is another thing that people do wrong is they tend to celebrate offense. They tend to celebrate metrics movers, right, in their org. And that makes people working on defensive things feel crappy because they never get celebrated. But really, you need to build a culture that celebrates like finding points of diminishing return and giving back resources. People should be, that's so valuable to the business because of the opportunity cost of that, right? And so you should be celebrating this idea that like, hey, we actually think we only need to invest this much in this tech debt and no more. And we figured out a way to cut that in half. Celebrate that all day, right? That's a huge impact to your business because of the opportunity cost of the savings that they have found, right?
Do you ever find conflicts between offense and defense teams?
That's a good question. I mean, on a really tactical, you just get a little deep in the weeds on the inside. There are pros and cons. Strategy focused orgs tend to have multiple teams hitting the same pieces of the code base, right? This is, I think a lot of companies have gone through this shift over the past 10 years, maybe, of like, the old style was we have teams that own features, right? Which like is very nice from we touch this piece of the code base, nobody else touches this piece of the code base, but isn't very good for driving business outcomes, right? And so like when you shift into the model of we have teams aligned to business outcomes, and defense is definitely one of those, you're going to have different teams touching different parts of the code base. So you have to deal with the coordination, overhead, and challenges of doing that. It's a pro and con. Like you pay that tax to be able to get that benefit.
What do you think are the biggest mistakes that founders make when it comes to this mindset of founders and product leaders, when it comes to this mindset of offensive and defensive?
The biggest mistakes I see are treating anything like not choosing is one, right? On the offensive side of like the whole point of strategy is to say no to most things and focus in on a small number of really high leverage things. Like you have to make that bet. And so when you see companies with 9 company level OKRs at the top level or whatever, right? It's like they're just trying to do all the things. Your chance of success is already low if you do not focus down on 1 or 2 core key bets and do that strategy work to figure out where that leverage is. You're not going to succeed. So that's one. It's just having way too many things that you're calling offense. That's one mistake. The other mistake actually is way too much defense, right? I've seen this in actually like logic books. There's sort of a human fallacy of because X thing is important, I'm just going to assume anything I do in that direction is important, right? And they just forget about this concept, or they're not thinking about this concept of diminishing returns. That is very, very common because they're like, well, we have to invest in X. Like, of course we do. It's like, yes, you do, but you're investing way too much. And the opportunity of doing that is way too high.
Eli, do you ever have it where sorry, my voice is going, I sound like a sexy Rod Stewart. Weren't expecting that in a podcast. Do you ever have an offensive, which actually turns out to be a neither? It could be a new feature, it could be a new product, and it doesn't work. What happens then?
Offense should not be about the solution. Your offense is not the solution. The offense is the leverage point that you are trying to move. And so that team's goal is to figure out how to move that leverage point, figure out what they need to do to move the metrics in that leverage point, and be learning as quickly as possible if that is the wrong bet, right? Like this is the thing is that this is another mistake you see a lot, which is like, I did some work to try to determine where that leverage is. I made a bet, and then I didn't question that bet for a long time, right? That happens all the time. Really, the thing to know is like, you need to be building confidence over time, and you need to pull forward the key riskiest assumptions in that bet, right? I think this is one of the key things. This is, again, something I help founders with all the time, which is how do we identify what the key riskiest assumptions are? And then how do we do things very quickly to essentially learn if we are wrong about one of those key assumptions that would mean that this is not the bet to be taking. And the earlier you can do those things, the better.
When you say there about kind of really understanding what you're driving towards in terms of like the incentive metric or the output, not the feature, so to speak. It makes me think of a conversation I had with Alex Schultz actually at Meta. And he said actually retention is king. Retention is king. How do you think about kind of the prioritization of retention today? And I know you have some contrarian views on this.
I mean, the one contrarian view that you see a lot is people tend to build teams focused on churn. And I think that's a mistake. I don't think you want to focus teams on churn. Retention is actually the thing you want to focus on. And actually, most of that is probably activation. I assume I think Brian probably talked to you about this because he and I talk about this a lot. But like generally, new user activation and getting people to the place where they experience the core value of your product and then build a habit around that value is your strongest lever to retention, which is the thing that is going to impact your churn metric. If you try to focus on churn, you're focused on these people are already lost. One, they maybe aren't even your ICP in the first place. Like you shouldn't be focusing your effort of trying to prevent people from churning who are not a good fit for your product, or you've already lost them, even if you're ICP, right? And you really should be moving your focus back probably to activation to really build strong retention. But absolutely, retention is important. Retention is the most important thing for sure.
Can I ask, when it comes to advisor roles, again, go back to that, what are the number one reasons they don't work out?
I think one of the things I have heard from founders, since I'm on the other side of the table here, but I've heard from founders about other advisors, is when you get a kind of advisor who has done a bunch of things before, and essentially their advice is do the things I did because they worked for me. That happens a lot. And what the challenge is, if their situation was meaningfully different from yours in a way that you may not even totally understand, that you're going to burn a lot of time trying the playbook that worked for them that doesn't actually work for the nuance of your business. Again, this is why I'm such a fan of the hands-on approach, which is like, yes, I'm bringing all of my past experience to bear, but I'm also in there with you making intentional decisions based on what's actually going on in your business.
I totally agree. Okay, so we have that as one reason. Any other reason why it doesn't work out as well?
On the founder side of that, if the founder is not willing to engage and commit to the relationship, then it doesn't work, right? Like at the end of the day, if the founder is not going to engage, not going to show up, like this happens sometimes, especially with high level advisors, the founder's just too busy, right? Like it's just not going to work. You need to get to that working relationship where you're aligned and working together on driving outcomes for your business, and you're doing that in an engaged period. Again, it's kind of retention. It's kind of activation, right? You got to get the activation for that thing to go so that that founder has a habit of working with this advisor consistently and driving outcomes.
How many advisor positions do you think you can have? How do you think about capacity and load on the advisor side?
Depends on the person. I can tell you about me. So again, I do this full time right now. And I think have like 6 people that I'm working with at the same time. I probably can do a couple more than that, but that's about as many as I want to do it at any given time. I'm pretty close to the ground though. Like I'm spending an hour with them every week plus additional time where I'm just diving into their stuff. And so I think like, depending on the level of advising you're doing, you could do more. At high level advising, you could take tons of clients.
How do you think about when you've extracted enough value from the advisor? Again, like therapists, sometimes you need to change or you don't need to see them anymore. How do you know when's the end life of that?
Yeah. Again, if you are working closely with them, if you need to be doing that. If you're working closely with them, it's going to start getting obvious that you're not getting the right value of that relationship. You're going to know. You're going to get to the point in your business. And this does happen, right? Like advisors will be better at certain types of things than other types of things. And if the things that are important for your business are the things that they are good at, you're going to get lots of value. And as your business progresses, if you move into things that they are not as good at, you're going to pretty quickly know that you're not getting the same level of value from that relationship. And you need to start looking for somebody who is really good at the next set of problems that you have.
What do you personally find the hardest things about being an advisor?
Top one is probably that it's kind of lonely, right? Like this is the solopreneur lifestyle. Like when you're an operator, you have a team around you, you're there every day, you're in person sometimes, so maybe not these days, right? As a solopreneur, you kind of have to find that. I mean, this is where, I have coffee with Casey. Luckily, he lives here. Elena doesn't come to town that much anymore, but like getting together with other solopreneurs is definitely one of the things I do to help have a community. But that is one of the big downsides is you don't really have a team, right?
I totally agree. Sorry, I'm just peppering you with questions now that I have.
Yeah.
Should grow, and this is one that I get a lot. Should growth teams be independent? Should they sit with inside product teams? How do you advise on that?
It depends, but let me kind of break down some of the factors here. I think in general, the model now is to have growth be embedded in everything that you're doing. There was a period of time, and there still may be companies who need to do this. There was a period of time from essentially nobody thinking about growth. It was necessary to pull those things out into their own orgs to help that org sort of make that maturity step into starting to think about growth and starting to bring together those functions. Honestly, a bunch of those companies have now moved to the third step, which is now integrating that into everything they do. So if you are a company that is at the first stage, it may well be the right step for you to go to having a separate growth org, but you should think that your end goal is to integrate growth into everything that you're doing.
Eli, what's the best growth decision you've made and what did you learn from it?
Honestly, the growth things that I have seen that drive the most upside are almost always in activation. Just to come back to that one, right? Activation is really that place where it makes the difference between you've got a bunch of people who could have value from your product to getting them to the point where they have a engaged habit long-term getting value from that product. And again, this is back to the retention is king, right? Like retention stacks your business, retention drives engagement, which drives virality. Like it's just all the things. And so if there's a whole process you should go through to figure out where your leverage is and focus on the top leverage area. And it is not always activation, but that one has come to the top the most.
What are the biggest fuck ups people make in activation? Is it messaging? Is it not building a habit? Is it shitty onboarding where there's no customer education and it's like a blank screen of death? What are the activation fuck up you see the most?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one of them is not understanding your ICP, because again, depending on how good your top of funnel is, you are likely acquiring a lot of people who are not a great fit for your product. And so one of the biggest things I see people do wrong is they see they have a conversion problem. They point a team at conversion and they look at the conversion metric overall. The problem is a bunch of those people are not ICP and they're never going to convert anyway. And so you're spending a lot of time trying to convert a bunch of people, and you're going to get marginal improvements to conversion because it's not all the way to activation. Like, you can make the button bigger, like things will happen. You'll move that metric, but it's just super under leveraged as opposed to really understanding who your ICP is, being able to track your ICP in that activation funnel so you know how well the ICP is doing, and then finding the highest leverage gap for those core ICP users and targeting that specifically.
I totally agree there. I find so many people actually don't even know their ICP, especially with this rise of horizontal products. They're like, we'll see. And you're like, fuck, no, we won't.
Yeah. Horizontal products also have an ICP. I love this one. I'm going to call this out even though you didn't ask. I think it's an important one for so many people. Horizontal products have an ICP because the true ICP should be defined in terms of attributes, not personas. It's about attributes. And attributes can be horizontal attributes. They are the attributes that the core group of people across a number of verticals or whatever have in common that make your product such a good fit for them.
Help me out here. What do you mean by that? So if we have like Airtable, it can be used by dentists and it can be used by PMs. Right. What are the attributes that we would take from that as a horizontal product?
Yeah. So, I mean, in the Airtable case, it's probably something like they have key problems in their business that require like collaboration on sets of data or something that is shared by a set of people. There are probably a number of other attributes that are sort of correlated to having that problem also, which you can then use for tracking and targeting and things like that. But they have that need.
Do you not worry that if you actually try and be everything to everyone, hey, collaborate more efficiently on data sets, it doesn't resonate with product orgs.
No,
it doesn't resonate with dentists, but you are right, but it's not home.
Yeah. So you shouldn't try to be everything to everyone. Again, actually, like when you're first starting a product, the general wisdom, and this holds true for horizontal as well, is that you should probably be pretty narrow. It's just in horizontal, you're narrow horizontally. Again, it's sort of like there's a core set of people across a number of different functions or business types where they have a really acute problem that is actually structurally similar to that really acute problem in a number of other verticals. And it's just those people that you're focused on, and you're focused on that kind of acute problem. Not every dentist, because every dentist doesn't have that same acute problem that Airtable needs, actually.
I get you. It's like the data entry ones who have large scale data entry problems or whatever that is. Eli, final one before we do a quick fire. What's the biggest mistake you've made in product, and how did you change your mindset as a result?
Early in my career, I did the thing that I think a lot of people do, which is be too focused on solutions, right? Be too focused on the feature and not think about the outcomes. I mean, this is part of the reason I'm now preaching this idea of outcomes so much, is these are the mistakes I made. Offense, defense, these are all mistakes I personally made, right? You see this in a lot of people. It's like they think about product as like, we want to build the coolest X or whatever. We want to make this thing better. And really, they need to be thinking about the outcomes they're trying to drive for the customer and for the business and where those things overlap.
How did that show itself in real life for you?
I don't know if I have a point in time that I can point to where I was like, had a light bulb over my head. I mean, I definitely think some of the sort of like 0 to 1 GM roles that I had push that home. Like this is maybe this is it now that I'm reflecting, which is like when you start out your product career or growth career working on a more mature product, it's easy to not really see the forest for the trees, right? Like you've got a lot going on. There's a lot of things already there. You're sort of a small piece. When you are doing 0 to 1, holistically, especially when it's a business unit, you have P&L, you have to see the forest. You now own the forest, right? You own the full set of outcomes. And so I think that shift maybe helped me made that mental shift.
Eli, I want to do a quick fire with you now. So I say a statement, you give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Let's try, yeah.
So what growth tactic has died a death in the last 5 years?
I mean, honestly, the concept of growth tactics has died a death. Like this whole idea of growth hacks, and there's a set of growth hacks that everybody can throw on to get quick wins. Growth is not about growth hacks, right? Growth is about
what
intentionally finding leverage and exploiting it. Yeah.
What about like growth channels? Like push notifications generally today irritate the fuck out of people and don't work.
Yeah.
Or they did.
Because they're oversaturated. I mean, lots of things are oversaturated. Paid is oversaturated in a lot of ways. I would say, though, that these things are not dead. They're dead as broad brush tools. Paid has channel, like has specific niches where it works well. Push notifications have specific niches where they work well. I think the idea that you can just slap a thing on, slap push notifications on something and drive up engagement, that's dead.
What one piece of advice would you give to a growth leader before they start a new role?
I'd say the most important things are understand that business. Like, is there opportunity? Is there leverage to be had in the business? I think this is something like they're hiring you because they need to help to grow, but you want to figure out if you're actually going to be able to be successful there. And two, does the founding team understand the growth mindset, right? This is a point about can we instill growth in everything we're doing? They may not have that yet if they're hiring you, but do they get it at the top level where they're going to be able to make that shift? Because if they're not going to be able to make that shift, you're going to be running uphill the whole time you're there.
You mentioned there before you join, you need to have like data to take action or to make decisions. Is it the founder's job to have clean and structured data for incoming data and product people?
I don't think it needs to be clean and structured, but they need to be able to iterate towards the things they need to learn. And so they need to have some data, and they need to have the ability to say, hey, we need to be able to measure X because X is really important, and we know how to go get that instrumented quickly.
Final one. What one company growth strategy have you been most impressed by recently?
Oh, this is a hard one. I think, the obvious one here is ChatGPT, but I feel like everybody, that's like too easy of
for me,
answer.
I think Canva Talk is amazing. Canva's TikTok is incredible. I think Notion's YouTube videos have been exceptional.
This is such a hard question. This is like you ask the foodie what's their favorite food, man. I'm an old school marketplace guy. I'm most excited by network effects. And so I really think the place like network effect things tend to be the things that get me most excited, actually. Those are the places that I'm most excited about. I think right now you're actually in an interesting place of a bunch of really early, and this wasn't exactly your question, but a bunch of really early kind of like potential network effect businesses, and then a bunch of much later stage, right? You've got your Instacarts, your Uber, your Lyft. They've kind of like gotten to where they need to be. There isn't actually very many people in that middle zone in terms of marketplace network effects today.
Which one are you most excited about in the early zone?
So in the really early zone, maybe I'll throw out a company that you haven't heard of because it's really, really early. But I know a founder of this company called Cashflow Portal that is essentially building the angel list for real estate investing in a way that has just never been done before. And I think this is a place where there are potential for network effects where there didn't used to be because of a market shift. This is, the core thing is like, has something changed about technology or something changed about a market that makes something possible that wasn't possible before?
I always ask that. Ely, listen, you put up with my incredibly intrusive questions. I've loved this. Thank you so much for joining me. And this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It's always fun to chat.